brand is the promise you make to the market. I try to keep things very simple. At a human level, we're all brands. And I would say in that setting, a brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room. In an Irish parlance, I grew up learning about reputation. Your reputation was critical. Well, what is that if it's not your brand?
That was Margaret Molloy, a master marketer and advocate for Brand Ireland. And I'm John Lee.
And I'm Martin Nutty. Welcome to another episode of Irish Stew, the podcast for the global Irish nation.
This episode of Irish Stew is sponsored by the Irish Heritage Tree Program. Celebrate your Irish roots by planting native trees for family and friends in the beautiful Golden Vale of Ireland. Go to irishheritagetree.com and use the exclusive discount code today. It's IrishStew10 for 10% off. That code again is IrishStew and the numeral 10. Keep the heritage of Ireland green and growing by going to irishheritagetree.com.
You're listening to Irish Stew. I am one of your co-hosts, Martin Nutty, and I'm joined in the virtual studio by John Lee. John, tell us about our upcoming guest or, anything other meaningful that you want to talk about.
No, we'll start right off with Margaret Molloy. Great to have her on. I met Margaret, I'm going to guess about a dozen years ago on the networking trail, and she was an important kind of Irish person for me to meet in New York. And also she introduced me to Jeffrey Hazlett, who was one of our very first guests on Irish Stew, who I worked for a couple of years. So the thing with Margaret is, where do you start with her? Do you start with her life in rural Offaly, where my grandmother happens to be from as well? Do we go to her university year in Belfast during the Troubles, her decision to come to America, her work bringing business to Ireland? How about her MBA degree from Harvard? I've heard that's quite a good school. And then there's her career in marketing and branding, her black belt level skills in networking, her social media savvy, perhaps best exemplified by a global Irish movement she started with nothing more than a hashtag wearing Irish. And I forgot to mention, she's also a podcast host of How CMOs Commit. Margaret, welcome.
Well, I'm delighted to be with you, John. That's a very generous introduction and lovely to see you too, Martin.
It's a pleasure.
Margaret, I think I was just skimming the surface there too. I left out about a page of your resume. But you're currently the Global Chief Marketing Officer for Siegel+Gale, an international branding agency. We're going to find out more about branding in just a bit. But I mentioned your podcast. Siegel+Gale and you both seem to center a lot of your brand on simplicity. And I listened to your latest podcast, and you had a panel. And towards the end of the panel, you asked each panelist for one word that meant simplicity for them. What does simplicity mean to them in one word? So I'm going to throw it to you, Margaret, and hear your one word on simplicity.
My word is elegance. I believe when you reach the epitome of simplicity, whether it's in vocabulary or in, frankly, ideas, problem solving, you have an elegant solution. And to me, elegance encompasses the aesthetic, the verbal, the cerebral, and the practical. So to me, simplicity and elegance are synonymous.
Beautiful. Great answer. And as I mentioned, we'll get into the whole branding piece. I want to learn more about it myself. I'm in an allied industry in public relations. We're both in that sort of messaging communications role. But before we get there, Martin, why don't we find out where Margaret's really from? Let's go back to her roots.
Just for listeners that are maybe not familiar with Irish geography, there's 32 counties in Ireland, and there are counties right in the middle of Ireland that are landlocked, and Margaret is from County Offaly. As John already mentioned, some of his forebears come from that part of the world. But if you were to kind of talk about Offaly's brand, Margaret, how would you describe it? And how did your family life fit into that?
Wow, none of these questions were prepped. I love it, gentlemen. So Offaly's brand, I lived literally in the middle of the country, a very flat terrain, perhaps not representative of the postcard images you see of Ireland. But what was interesting and perhaps unique about Offaly is it had quite a vibrant economy, because Bord na Móna, the peat authority at the time, had quite a number of operations in County Offaly, and it's still renowned for peat bogs, which essentially meant that a lot of the population from a very early age had access to employment. Now, like many circumstances, that's a double-edged sword, because it meant that very many young people didn't choose college as an option because they had an economic alternative, which essentially meant, up until very recently, I believe, Offaly was one of the counties in Ireland with the lowest third-level education attainment of the country. And circumstantial, it was what it was. Personally, I grew up on a dairy farm, the eldest of 6 children, and I was always very motivated by education. I found that I had a facility for academics, much more so than some of the other demands of living in rural life. And I chose to be a good student, ended up leaving Offaly after high school. I went to the Convent of Mercy, as it was then known, in Moat, now Moat Community School, and decided to go to Northern Ireland, as John mentioned, starting in Coleraine at the University of Ulster. And therein began my adventures of loving Offaly and leaving it at the same time.
So could I ask, sometimes people really succeed academically because in many respects, they find it easy, they're conventional, they're comfortable, shoehorning themselves into a very rigorously defined structure. And a lot of entrepreneurial types, that doesn't work for them. And you strike me as being kind of entrepreneurial. So is that a fair description of you? And despite your academic achievement, how did you manage to diverge?
Well, John and Martin, that's sort of interesting because, Martin, I don't know, did you do the Leaving Cert in Ireland?
I did indeed, yes.
I thought so. Well, the Leaving Cert's a very prescriptive exam. And I chose to be, as you identified, a little entrepreneurial. I decided there were 2 subjects for the Leaving Cert that I wanted to pursue that were not available at my high school. I went to an all-girls school. And in those days, in a girls' school, business studies was not an appropriate subject. But I decided to take that subject outside the curriculum and sit for the exam myself. I did the same with accounting. So I think your analysis is quite smart in the sense that I traversed both the rigorous and brought in a little bit of my own entrepreneurial perspective to craft my own curriculum.
And can I ask, you said you grew up in a dairy farm, and if there's anything I know about dairy farms, especially back 20, 30 years ago, is they were incredibly time demanding. I can imagine your father and your mother being unable to kind of leave the land because of the rigor demanded of that. Were you involved in that to some degree, and how did that affect you?
Well, certainly work ethic was core to the environment that I grew up in, Martin. It was only coupled with an appreciation for community and Catholic faith. Those were the values that permeated my upbringing. I was not talented in agriculture. And I think while I had tremendous respect for the work my parents did, arguably it was a motivator for me to find an alternative path. I saw how hard they worked for minimal returns. And I had a sense that I was, in the context of free education in Ireland, I had another set of opportunities, and I was incredibly hungry to take advantage of those, as did many of my generation. It was very much a generational thing.
And Margaret, what led you to take your university studies to Northern Ireland? It was certainly a very difficult time in the history of that part of Ireland.
John, there were probably two drivers. The first was a very content-driven component. I wanted to study business and Spanish. I had this perspective that Spanish was going to be a very important language. And I was fortunate in that my high school taught us Spanish. So I wanted to pursue that. And at the time in the Republic, the opportunity to do a combined business and languages major was only available with French or German. So content-wise, I found through my research, Coleraine offered business studies with Spanish. The second driver was an economic one. Interestingly enough, at the time, education was free in the United Kingdom, not so in the Republic. And because Ireland was part of the European Union, students had the opportunity under the freedom of movement of people to be able to go and travel and get access to the same opportunities as citizens of the other country. So essentially, as a student from the Republic, I was able to take advantage of tuition-free education in Northern Ireland, which was a lovely bonus when you're the eldest of six.
And what was the kind of political backdrop to your time there? What was going on, and how did it affect you?
It was extraordinary, John. I had never been to Northern Ireland. Living, as Martin pointed out, in Offaly, it didn't impact us. We heard a little on the news, but I had no sense for what the troubles were. And as a student, I was focused on the academics and college, and it didn't seem relevant to my decision, frankly, at the time. When I arrived, I was struck by so many different stimuli that were vastly different from what I experienced in Ireland. For example, the police force being armed. I had never experienced that before. Then when I went to college, the perception, which was interesting, of a number of us who traveled from the South, we were referred to occasionally as Mexicans. And it was in a pejorative sense. The notion being that we'd come across the border for free education. And we were typically diligent students. So that was an interesting sort of bias to be aware of out the gate. Then very practically, when we would occasionally come home for the weekends, I would take the train into Belfast and then home. And very often you would get a message that you need to get off the train. There's a bomb on the line at Portadown, board a bus to come home. And that became part of our normal. So we lived essentially during my college era in a war-torn zone, and it was our normal. And I think ultimately, as I reflect on it, it's made me more aware of different environments, more mindful of other people, more cognizant of my own privilege as I moved through life. So it was a very formative period. And I'm fortunate to have many friends in the region and feel very lucky to have had the opportunity to spend time in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, we had a guest, Colin Broderick, a actor, writer, filmmaker, and he talked about his growing up in Tyrone. He would have been younger. This would be more of a kid's experience into a teenager. He said it was normal. And looking back at that, it's incredible that I thought that was normal.
Yes,
but that's just the way it was.
I'm wondering, Margaret, did your parents have any misgivings about you going up to Northern Ireland? Clearly, obviously it was on the news every night, pretty much, at least that was my experience growing up in Ireland. But I kind of identify with the sense that was happening somewhere else. It didn't really impinge that directly on my life in Dublin. But on the other side of the ledger, we weren't tripping over ourselves to go visit Northern Ireland, considering how unstable it was, from a political violence point of view. So was there concerns in your family about your choice to go to Coleraine?
I think there was a healthy dose of naivete and trust in that I was making the decisions for the right reasons. There was always anxiety on those Fridays when my mom would hear about the bomb on the line from Belfast. But beyond that, it's extraordinary, really, because I'm a parent myself now of 2 teenagers. And I think our parenting culture is much more involved than that of my parent, probably because of the economic reality. As you identified, they had other priorities and other children. And I do respect immensely their trust in my judgment.
So, Margaret, I was thinking it's a little bit of a case of out of the frying pan into the fire. You left Northern Ireland and you found your way to peaceful, bucolic New York City. And a lot going on in New York City that was a little bit war-torn in those days as well. What motivated you to come to New York, and what were some of your early experiences here?
So, John, from the moment I got out of that plane in JFK, hit by the heat on that August day, I knew it was home for me. Reflecting back, a couple of stories your audience may find interesting. As a child, part of the folklore of our family was the fact that my father's great aunt, Bridget Henry, left Ireland in 1912 aboard the Titanic, never to make it to New York. And that essential narrative that was so core to our family's history informed a distaste for America. It had no allure among most of my family. But for me, it had an allure because I felt a little bit of that 20-something-year-old woman who was on her way to join her sister to be a domestic servant in Boston. And that was her ambition. And alas, she didn't get to fulfill that. But for me, in the back of my mind, subconsciously, now as I think about it as an adult, that gave the United States some allure for me, that unfulfilled journey of Bridget Henry. Another thing, way back as a child, I remember, was it 1984 when President Ronald Reagan visited Ireland. I was glued to the television. I was very naive to politics. But what I saw was this gentleman who had poise and presence, who was at once Irish and American. And in President Reagan, I made a mental note that you can achieve in this wonderful land of the American dream. So those were some of the somewhat below the surface influences. As a practical matter, I had to make a living. And my first job was with Enterprise Ireland. And I applaud the recruiters there who recognized in me a fit with the United States and chose me to come as an intern to New York to do that job, which I loved doing, because the mission of the organization was essentially to promote Ireland's goods and services. And that was a mission I could get behind.
And that, if I understand it correctly, Margaret, was a case of that point in time where Ireland was starting to promote itself to American companies as a service-based economy. But that's also kind of like the internet really hadn't kicked in at that point in time. So can you talk a little bit about what Enterprise Ireland was trying to do there and your efforts?
Yes, Martin. Essentially, there were 2 steps to it. I began as a naive, super enthusiastic intern, as I said, with Enterprise Ireland, spent a year there, and their mission was some combination of goods and services, but promoting Ireland and Irish companies. When that internship completed, I joined Telecom Ireland, the Irish phone company's American office. You will have known it, John and Martin, as Eircom, the Irish carrier. And in that capacity, where I spent over 3 years, the role was around economic development, promoting Ireland as a base for inward investment. So in collaboration with IDA Ireland and other companies focused on that same area, we worked to bring call centers and back offices and ultimately internet companies like Gateway 2000, Dell, Best Western hotels, those sort of entities to Ireland to serve as the base for their European operations. The period became known as the Celtic Tiger, and it was a vibrant period because the product, Ireland, was a wonderful product. It had talented youth who spoke many languages, were educated. It had a vibrant telecommunications system, a very favorable fiscal environment, generous government incentives, and a wonderful culture from a work flexibility perspective. So during that period, it was very much around economic development, or what became known as FDI, foreign direct investment into Ireland. And it was an absolute privilege to be part of that work during the 90s.
And in thinking about that time, when I talk to people about the amazing economic success that Ireland has achieved, over the last 30 years, looking back, I kind of say, how important was the Irish-American card in building that book of business, if you will, for Brand Ireland?
I think it played a role in opening doors, but ultimately it didn't close the deal. When I look back on it, I mentioned some of the factors that made the product attractive. Available workforce, highly educated, as I said, a favorable fiscal environment from a tax standpoint, work ethic, a very much open for business, pro-business culture. Those factors were more important in sealing the deal than any, I think, affinity that the leaders had to Ireland. Now, that positive perception of Irish people as hard workers and welcoming certainly were good conversation starters. But I imagine if we spoke to my colleagues in IDA Ireland, they would definitely underline it was the quality of the offering, particularly the workforce and the telecommunications infrastructure that was very favorable.
And I think, looking back into the 90s, one of the propositions that was being offered was a very cost-competitive workforce. I don't think that's so much the case anymore, because Irish workers, by dint and virtue of the overall achievement of the company, have kind of climbed the ladder, the value proposition ladder. In other words, you go from, let's say, a telecom support job to more high-end tech development, which you kind of see in Dublin right now. So I would assume a very different challenge now to bring in, foreign direct investment in Ireland. To what degree do you kind of monitor that or stay in touch with that? Is that a kind of a passing curiosity since you're, like me, a long time in America now and just an outside observer?
I'm deeply interested in it, although I'm far from being an expert. But my observation is that, as you've identified, the metric here is value. What is the value that the Irish worker is bringing to the conversation and to the employer? And I believe they've stepped up in terms of the value chain, to your analysis. I also believe it's a much more diverse population now. So it's a different set of skills. And I think there's a whole other conversation around Indigenous industry in Ireland and how the infrastructure has expanded to support the foreign direct investment. But also it's wonderful to see the evolution of entrepreneurship and the confidence of the Irish entrepreneurs to have their own companies and be not necessarily limited by foreign direct investment, but in fact to be net contributors and net employers and net job creators, even in places like the United States. So it's wonderful to see the maturity of the Irish economy, and dramatic credit goes to IDA Ireland and the government for their wisdom and foresight to help create this brand that was so receptive and continues to be a vibrant one.
Margaret, I really want to get back to that discussion, but I want to make sure we cover A couple of gaps in your resume that we haven't discussed. One would be not too many Offaly dairy farmers go to Harvard Business School, and a little tale of how that happened. And then we want to talk a little bit about your journey through marketing, which has been quite remarkable.
Well, thank you, John. At the beginning, we mentioned that education was important to me. And when I was working for Telecom Ireland, I realized there was a gap. I call that an American credential. I felt I needed, not limited to the credential, but for the learning and the experience that would afford me. So I chose to apply to business school, and Harvard accepted that application, spent 2 years there, loved it. It was an extraordinary window into the education system in the United States, and frankly, the access and exposure to which I didn't have before. I mentioned a lot in the earlier part of our conversation, a level of naivete. I had that, and I had the ambition, I had the hustle. But when you go to somewhere like a Harvard Business School, on the one hand, it's very humbling because you realize what you didn't have. But on the other hand, it gives you a tool set and a network, and I took full advantage of that.
And Margaret, what brought you into marketing? Why that path?
Well, John, you can probably tell it's a combination of storytelling and analytics, and that feels just right for me.
Well, without stopping at every stop along the way on your marketing career, you're in a very interesting space now, branding, with Siegel+Gale as Chief Global Marketing Officer. I think the central question, I think there's often a lot of, I'm in public relations, and public relations overlaps with advertising, and marketing is on a similar path but uses a different language. Branding is part of that whole communications mix of business. But really for you, what is branding?
A brand is the promise you make to the market. I try to keep things very simple. At a human level, we're all three brands on this call. And I would say in that setting, a brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room. In an Irish parlance, I grew up learning about reputation. Your reputation was critical. Well, what is that if it's not your brand? So that's how I define it. It's evolved tremendously, John. In the business setting, when I entered the world of marketing, brands was essentially about words and pictures, your strapline and your logo. Well, today, brand is about experiences. It's about how people experience your company and your offering. And the other shift that's really material, John, since we began our careers, was the ethos around the Milton Friedman School of Marketing, if you will, or School of Business more broadly, where the focus was exclusively on profits. Shareholders were the only stakeholders that matter. Today, that has gotten infinitely more complex because there's a realization that your brand has to matter to myriad stakeholders, customers, employees, regulators, the community, partners in your ecosystem. So it's a dynamic world, and it's a fascinating one to me.
It's also global, as your title implies. So
yes,
I know there's messaging that's different per country or community, but there still has to be something overarching that translates across all national boundaries.
That's right, John. And the way I think about that when I'm talking to colleagues and customers in other markets, I say it has to have that singular voice, but it can adopt a local accent to be relevant in the region.
I imagine you have clients that come to you who have the wrong idea of what their own brand is or don't have any clue what their brand is. It must be quite a process, aligning and coming together on that.
It certainly is. There are a number of triggers when clients come to us. One is a merger or an acquisition or a divestiture. They need to stand up a new company, or there's a combination, and this new company needs to articulate its brand visually, experientially, verbally. Another driver, a new CEO or a new CMO arrives, and inherently their ambition for the brand is greater than the status quo. So that engages in exercise. A third driver, the brand just looks dated and needs a refresh. Perhaps a fourth, a company has had a reputation challenge and they need to re-communicate what they're about. And often, of course, that requires revisit internally what they are about to communicate that to their various stakeholders.
You know, Margaret, I think about when I started my business career, I was in an office that had a terminal. There were no PCs. There was no email. Communications offshore were done with this incredible invention called a fax machine. I imagine that branding must have gotten infinitely more challenging just by the simple development of social media platforms and how a company can be damaged almost instantly by somebody saying the wrong thing at the wrong time, or even worse, somebody malicious taking something totally out of context and spinning it to try, for whatever reason, to damage that organization. So is that an area that you cross over into or deal with, or how do companies kind of deal with these issues now going forward?
Well, I think the fundamental shift that you've identified, Martin, is from a mindset where your brand was a broadcast and you controlled your brand. Back to John's career, you were essentially putting out the messages. Whereas now your brand lives in the hearts and minds and the experiences of those who encounter it. Now, some of the scenarios that you depicted come into the realm of crisis management, which is a whole other discipline. But it's that mindset shift that I would underline. And that has all kinds of implications. You've identified myriad channels now, but it's the mindset that's the most important. And that speaks to what I brought up earlier, which is it's about experiences. So much of branding now is co-creation. It's not created in the marketer's office. The marketer and colleagues and agencies can help articulate it in language that will resonate and in visuals and articulate experiences that are compelling. But ultimately, the brand is experienced by stakeholders through everyone who works for the company now and everyone in the ecosystem. So it's an infinitely more complex scenario, which means essentially for the marketer, there are people who do not work in marketing that impact the brand. Let's go full circle. I talked earlier about call centers early in my career. Well, that's a very important marketing touch point. Invariably, the call center doesn't work for the marketing department. So the scope of the marketer traverses many colleagues. The tools have changed, but additionally, they must affect the brand as much through influence of colleagues who don't work for them as through previously broadcasting messages.
You said broadcasting messages, and then you kind of contrast it with this more of a two-way flow or multi-way flow back and forth of information. It seems like social media comes along at just the right time for that new kind of thinking. And Margaret, every time I look, you're on a new list of the top 10 CMOs on social media. And I think it fits in with your focus on networking. Let's talk a little bit about those two worlds that you're extremely active in.
Yes, John, let's think about the networking part, because I see social media as tools and platforms, not in and of themselves meaningful. Look, I mentioned that I came to the United States fresh out of college. I had no family here, no relatives, no neighbors from my town growing up in Offaly, as Martin said. So getting to know people and to build trust was integral to survival as a young woman coming to New York with a one-way ticket and a one-year internship. Those were essentially the assets that I had and a strong desire to stay here. So however, John, I don't think about it as networking. and it's not semantic. I think about it as connecting, because how we perceive and how we think about things informs our behavior. So I will always frame my attitude as I like to connect with people, as many people as I can in a meaningful way, and I like to stay connected. And the social media platforms that you've identified are marvelous mechanisms to scale networking and to keep in touch. So that's a component. Again, as we think about the arc of this conversation, it reminds me of how my approach has changed, John, over the years since that naive 20-something. The biggest dimension of change has been my desire to build more diversity into my network. I started from a place of connecting with Irish people that circled out to connecting with marketers and professionals. Then it went out to connecting with Harvard Business School alums and women. But those were all communities that were close in to my background. And in recent years, I've put significant effort into building a much more diverse network on many, many dimensions. Intentionally so, because I know I need to learn from others. I also need to invite others into my communities. And I would encourage others to do the same. It's been very enriching and more socially and developmentally than merely commercially. And I think that's been the biggest change. But fortunately, that muscle memory I built very early on, and happy to share with your listeners anything that's helpful in terms of how to approach connecting versus networking.
Yeah, I'm curious, given our shared Irish background, people are reticent, I would say, at least people of my generation are reticent of self-promotion. And I wonder how you see self-promotion and networking with this mix of complexity of almost deference that was my generation in Ireland. How different it is in America, what Ireland can learn from, the American networking experience, and maybe what Americans can learn from the Irish experience.
That's such an interesting perspective, and I find myself nodding because growing up in Ireland, it was uncouth to be braggy. That was just not appropriate behavior. Certainly not back to that word I would have chosen for simplicity. Certainly wouldn't be elegant to self-promote. However, Martin, I would flip the script and say, it's not about self-promotion, it's about role modeling. It's about showing others pathways. It's about working out loud and showing what can be done and what can be achieved, and creating, I suppose, representing other communities and representing your community and storytelling. So I don't see it so much as self-promotion. I see it as marketing, which is not unexpected given my DNA. I'm not coy, and I think people who tend to be a little coy struggle with this idea of telling your story. Like many things in life, I believe it's how you do it. You can be promotional, whether it's a product, a service, or indeed your own accomplishments, and do it with grace. And that's certainly something I strive to do. But honestly, I feel, particularly as a woman who came from a modest background, an obligation to showcase the possibilities to other young women, to other immigrants, to other aspiring marketers, because that was something I didn't have growing up. I didn't have those kinds of role models, and I feel an obligation and a desire to serve in that role, however I can be helpful to others. You asked about the Irish component, and I think there's a certain natural storytelling and natural connector component that is in the Irish DNA. while it will not lean toward self-promotion, it will lean towards finding ways to help. Look, Martin, growing up in Ireland, you would meet someone and invariably your mom would know their uncle or connect them to someone else in the community. Rumor has it that you're quite the connector yourself. So that mindset is very natural. It's just a question of how you activate it and own it.
Yeah, I call it the 2 degrees of Irish separation. Unlike the rest of the world, which is 6 degrees, Ireland is just simply, and I'm sure if we delved a little bit, we would probably find multiple lines of connection, obviously beyond John on this episode. But just curious now, you've been in the States for over 20 years. How do you view your Irishness at this point of time? How American are you? How Irish are you? What exactly are you at this point?
So part of the reason why I love your podcast is because you allow your guests and your audience to have multiple identities. I think it's a false choice to require us to choose a country. I'd say it like this, Martin. Identity is not correlated with nativity. I was born in Ireland, but my identity has many facets. I've lived longer in the United States now than in Ireland, and it has an extraordinary influence on who I am as a person. So I reject the choice and embrace the duality of that identity.
A lot of times I'll talk about there's a tension between the Irish of Ireland and the Irish diaspora. And sometimes it can be counterproductive. Conversations along the line of, an Irish American showing up in Ireland and saying they're Irish and then being quickly corrected that they are not Irish. What, from a branding point of view, would you suggest to Irish people so that they understood maybe an opportunity that's being missed here by that kind of an interaction?
I think I would say open the aperture and welcome anyone who wants to share in a positive experience. There's so much positivity toward Ireland and Irishness. Why not share? There's plenty to go around, and consider it a learning experience and a deep compliment that someone wants to affiliate. I have 2 sons, Martin. I mentioned my teenagers, and I've asked them this question, frankly, in anticipation of this conversation. And they said to me, I asked, are you Irish or are you American? And they said, New Yorkers. Which speaks to this whole concept of the fluidity of identity. I was asking the wrong question. They too need to open their aperture. But it is very interesting that they see their Irishness much more now in school, where they have colleagues and friends who share different identities. Our generation coming up, I think, has a much healthier outlook. And I know John has a wonderful daughter as well. They have a healthier outlook on identity. They don't limit it, as I said, to nativity. They don't limit it to gender, race, sexual orientation. I think that's the mindset we all need to embrace.
Margaret, I've got 2 more lines of inquiry I'd like to pursue before we let you go back to your real life there at Siegel+Gale and your family and everything else going on. And you say open the aperture. The next thing I want to mention is something that I think pulls together a lot of elements. We're talking about branding. We're talking about Indigenous Irish industries. We're talking about connections. We're talking about support. #wearing Irish. Did it surprise even you how much this took off?
Yes, John, it definitely did. The quick backstory. A number of years ago now, as Martin said, I'm still a very active observer of branding of Ireland. I had observed the excellent work Tourism Ireland was doing around their greening campaign. And you may be aware, this is a campaign they conduct in March where they get the monuments around the world to illuminate in green. And the wonderful insight behind that campaign is that Ireland is the only country in the world that owns a colour. That colour is green. And I was looking at this campaign around the time that Instagram was on my radar. And I said, what better way to show patriotism than coat yourself in green? So I decided for an entire month to wear, and you'll remember this, John, around town in New York, and then posting pictures on Twitter and on Instagram, clothing myself in green for an entire month. Every day I would post a picture, Martin. It's quite crazy. This middle-aged woman putting pictures of herself wearing green clothing, who's not of model proportions, and just playing with Instagram, but embracing the greening that was the campaign that Tourism Ireland executed so well. And at the end of it, I got a lot of publicity. But honestly, it felt a little shallow. I realized that although I was wearing green and I was elevating Ireland, I was helping no Irish designer. I was indifferent to where the clothing was made or who the designer was. If it was green, it made the cut. So the following year, I said, I've been way too literal. I was wearing green. I'm going to shift this to wearing Irish. And I decided that month to wear Irish designers every day, clothing, fashion accessories, etc., and invited others to join me. And that really captured the imagination of many people, both sides of the pond. And they started sharing pictures themselves, as did John, in a very wonderful attire.
I had my full Irish kit on for you, Margaret.
You were stunning. One of the early male adopters of the movement. Fast forward to 2019, just before the pandemic, and we created a very significant competition inviting Irish designers to compete for one of 10 places to come to New York and show their wares and meet many different communities to learn about the industry here and potentially find new customers. And that was started with the hashtag, ended up in an event, and had great outcomes for a number of designers. And I must applaud many Irish companies, from Bank of Ireland to the Department of Foreign Affairs, CIE Tours, Tourism Ireland, Invest Northern Ireland, who supported me economically in making that ambitious goal of bringing 10 Irish designers to the US to showcase their wares. Because ultimately, my belief is that the island of Ireland is brimming with creativity. And we've done, as a country and as Brand Ireland, an extraordinary job of promoting the country as an ideal location for economic investment, as an island that welcomes everyone for hospitality, as a place and as a people for philanthropy, for the performing arts. We are renowned. However, I believe fashion is very accessible. It is a language in and of itself. And if we lean into supporting our designers, the positive externalities that accrue to the brand of Ireland far transcend the economic positive outcomes, although they are important for the fashion sector. It's a more underdeveloped conversation as it pertains to the Irish brand. And I would finally say that I'm very proud and pleased to see since then that within the island of Ireland, there is greater enthusiasm to support the local designers. And I'm proud to have played, albeit a very small part, in advancing that conversation.
Well, Margaret, I said I had two lines of inquiry for you. You really covered them both, because the next one was going to be about what is Brand Ireland, and I think you just summarized it right there. Martin, any final closing thoughts?
I'm just thinking there is a density of ideas that have been presented in this podcast. I listen to every podcast that we put out multiple times, but there's a density of ideas in here that kind of really bears really deep reflection. So I'm looking forward to listening through this again, because there's a lot of food for thought. I'm just thinking, when I look at Ireland, and you used a phrase a couple of times, indigenous. And in a world where things, products and services sometimes can be positioned to be cookie cutter and put in every country, this kind of global marketing approach, one size fits all, leaves me personally cold. So can you talk a little bit about the virtue of indigenousness from a marketing perspective and branding perspective?
So, Martin, I think I always start from the perspective of the customer or the buyer. And as we look at trends, I believe there is a desire among many consumers for provenance in the products and services they consume or procure. I say or procure because there is another trend towards investment and less about transactional relationships with products. A third is there is a desire to know the maker. And that is pretty prominent in the fashion world. Another driver of this enthusiasm for locally produced products and services is the whole conversation around sustainability and a movement away from fast fashion to products, I speak particularly in the fashion world, that are much more sustainably produced, and clothing and accessories that can live for beyond a season. So all of those conversations that are happening right now, accelerated by the pandemic, bode well for handmade or locally produced or locally sourced products and services. So I believe the Irish fashion industry, notwithstanding some of the need for investment, demands for infrastructure, it's very underdeveloped, but its time has come, Martin. The factors are there, and the awareness and the sophistication of the buyer and the consumer meets, and in fact, I think is ready for, has an appetite for locally produced and locally created. A final thing I would say, I'll make it very personal for you and go full circle. When I came to the United States, I had a strong desire to assimilate and be part of this culture. And one of the ways one does that, and to show, if you will, a level of status, is to buy a handbag or buy a certain recognizable logo product to wear on your person. And I did that in my 20s and in my 30s. I've shifted dramatically because I think as you become older, you realize that, and I'm fortunate to have the ability to be able to purchase these items now. I certainly did not as a child. But you realize that whom you support in your purchases and the items you buy speak to you as a brand, and you don't want to be cookie cutter. I no longer want to confer status by wearing a product that I have no connection to. So this sort of brings our conversation home, Martin, in the sense that I'm talking about connection to the makers. I'm talking about differentiation, not having that same handbag or whatever it is, although it may confer status, it's quite hollow to me. So, and I believe I am not alone in that. There are many people, as they go through that journey, they want to make a difference with their purchases, and they want what they wear to represent a story about them that's much deeper and more profound than I have the wherewithal to acquire an item of a certain price tag.
Let me just push back a little bit on that. We live in a business environment where people constantly talk about scale. Mm-hmm. Right? We're talking here about handmade, indigenous, etc. can those two things possibly square at all? In other words, if the game is to sell as much product as one possibly can and to get as big as fast as possible, how do you maintain that authenticity, or is that a pipe dream?
I believe there are niches and there are scales, and they are not mutually exclusive. Back to the open the aperture and my rejecting the false choice, Martin, I think there is a yes and is the answer to your question. But implicit in your inquiry is an important point. The industry in Ireland needs investment to help scale. We have spent a lot of effort supporting other industries, and with right judgment, foreign direct investment, for example, the technology sector, very good decisions. I believe that from an industrial policy standpoint, there's an opportunity to invest and to consider the impact of that investment on the design community. Because you're absolutely right, Martin, there has to be a commercial imperative, and it translates into pricing. And if the quality is there, there's a market at every price point. Not an easy problem to solve, but I think we haven't applied all the great minds and creativity to that it deserves. Here's the core thing that I think may be missing from an industrial policy perspective. The thinking that it's a small industry, there are only so many jobs that can be supported if we make the investment. Yes, and if we present the country of Ireland as a nation of makers, that has reverberating positive impact on brand Ireland that will have all kinds of implications beyond the sector. And no better man to talk to you about that for your morning coffee than John Lee, whose wife comes from a country that nailed it. If we think about Italy and what Italy has done over the years to present itself as somewhere that has essentially squared that you can have wonderful product at the right price with the authenticity, and the brand stands for all of those qualities.
Margaret, beautiful place to wrap up here. And we have to bring out our mascot, Seamus Plug, now, and we'll offer you an opportunity to let our listeners know something that's important to you, something you'd like them to know more about.
Well, thank you for that. And I love the signature element of Seamus Plug. Absolutely love it. Look, I will take advantage of this opportunity to invite people to check out an Irish designer. And how can you do that? You can find @WearingIrish on Instagram. I have a blog that is linked, and lots of stories of wonderful designers. So Wearing Irish on Instagram is the best place to find that. In terms of the branding and all the work Siegel+Gale is doing, I invite your wonderful audience to follow me on LinkedIn, where I proudly share that work.
Margaret, thanks so much. We've known each other for a while, but we've never had the chance to sit down and talk in this way. And glad you get a chance to meet Martin Nutty.
Pleasure, gentlemen, and congratulations on the podcast. I am an avid listener, huge fan, and really applaud what you are doing to open all our eyes and ears to the diversity and plurality of Irish identity.
Open the aperture. Well, we'll share our thoughts on that episode in just a second, but our call to action this week: if you enjoy Irish Stew, just subscribe. We're on every platform that's out there. Just give us a subscription. Make sure you listen to each and every episode. But Martin, let's get back to the episode we just heard. What's your take on the Margaret Molloy brand?
A lot of times after an episode, I'll think about a key word. And the key word for this episode for me was aperture, which, of course, for people that are into photography, refers to lens size. But I hadn't heard it in this context before, and I think it was totally on point. When we were talking about the inclusiveness of the Irish community, and I suggested that certain folks in Ireland may find the notion of people referring themselves to Irish that weren't actually born there how that might be a problem or get in people's way. Margaret's response was simply open the aperture. Because one of the things we're trying to do in this podcast is introduce Irish people to members of the Irish diaspora that have had enormous achievements and how they're a resource for the people of Ireland and vice versa. So if there's any message that I'd like to continue to communicate in this podcast is to open the aperture. We're all stronger when we're thinking of Ireland in global terms, and we're all stronger when we're inclusive. And Margaret articulated that particularly well.
And when you open the aperture, you let in more light, which is something we're trying to do here as well, very much in line with our goals. Now, one thing that struck me about Margaret is a lot of our guests seem to kind of wander through their lives and they figure it out as they go. It's one step in front of another. And I wouldn't say Margaret had a plan of how to get from point A to point Z, but I was very impressed with the thought that went into going from point A to point B, why she went to the university she did, why she came to America, why she realized that an MBA was something that she needed. And she's been a very important person to me about a dozen years ago. I'm so happy to add her great voice to the Irish Stew brand.
Absolutely. Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.